Welcome, everybody. My name is Margot Landman. I'm Deputy Vice President for Programs of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to today's program, which I think will be extremely interesting. After I introduce our moderator, I will turn the program over to him. He and our guest will have a conversation, and then we will answer as many audience questions as we can get to. To submit a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and include your name and affiliation as well as your question. Our moderator is Nelson Dong. And as far as the National Committee is concerned, his most important attribute is that he is a director of the National Committee. His law firm would probably beg to differ and say that they are proudest of him for being a senior partner at Dorsey & Whitney in their Seattle office, where he heads the firm's National Security Law Group and is responsible for a variety of areas of practice, including export controls, economic sanctions, national security, and international tech law. There's much more on him, but I don't want to spend the whole program on him. Our author today is Mara Hvistendahl, who has written a really fantastic book called The Scientist and the Spy, about, well, I'll let her say what it's about. So with that, I will turn it over to Nelson, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you to the staff of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for making this program possible today. It is really quite a distinct honor and privilege for me, both as a director of the National Committee, but also as what I hope is a professional friend of Mara's, to be her moderator today on this program. It is a singular achievement in what she has done in authoring the book, The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. And I think it's a great public service to help us understand these incredibly complex, both personal and international issues that she describes in her book. So Mara, welcome to our program, and I hope we're going to have a good conversation over the next half hour or so, and then we will open it up for the staff to read some of the audience questions from around the country and indeed from around the world for people who have registered for this program. As Margot said, we will try to do as many of the questions as we can at the final portion of this program, but we have approximately 250 people who pre-registered for this program. So obviously we won't be able to get to everybody's question if they do all want to ask something. And we had already received questions in advance in writing from some of the people who registered. So Mara, obviously authors don't come to us delivered by storks. You've had a long career as a journalist, including time spent in China. Before we get into the substance of the book, could you give us a little bit of personal background, how you came to be a journalist, and in particular, a journalist focusing on the intersection of China and science and technology?
Sure. Well, thank you to the National Committee for hosting me, and thanks, Nelson, for moderating. I'm very honored to be here virtually today. I started out as a freelance journalist in China in 2004. I had studied Chinese in college at Swarthmore, and then went to journalism school at Columbia. And after I graduated, just on the suggestion of some editors, moved to China to start out freelancing. And pretty early on, I ended up writing for science magazines. I did not have a background in that area, but I kind of fell into that coverage. And it was a very fascinating time to be covering that area because there were just so much rapid development, and also that was also true of the sciences. There was also at the same time, you know, corruption and graft, and I got to see kind of the seedier side, no pun intended, of what was going on. But you know, it was just a fascinating window into that period of development in China.
So what years were you in China doing that work?
From 2004 to 2010, and then I left for 2 years. I came back in 2012, and stayed till 2015. For those last years, I worked for Science. So I was a news correspondent with the journal, and you know, I covered a lot of projects involving scientific cooperation between people, between researchers in the U.S. and China. There are a lot of phenomena that we know about because of these cooperative ties. You know, things like the degree of inequality in China, the widening income gap, that's a result of a collaborative project. The extent to which girls are missing from the population. My first book was about demography and about the missing girls. And these are all things that were the product of cooperation during that period. But I did also get to see, you know, during that period, I did a big investigation for Science on a paper selling scheme, which was a just a massive effort to defraud international scientific journals and sell slots on paper. So I got to see kind of both sides of that period of Chinese science.
So I recall when I first met you some years ago, you had also begun doing a series of articles about academic misconduct and industrial espionage and some of the criminal cases that were then being brought by the U.S. Justice Department. Could you give us a nutshell summary of some of that work and how that led into your book?
Right. So in 2014, I started seeing news of trade secrets theft cases involving often ethnic Chinese scientists in the United States who were being charged criminally in U.S. federal court. So, you know, I got interested in this beat of mine that was suddenly very much in the news back in the United States. One of the initial cases that I looked into involved this man named Mo Hailong, or Robert Mo, who had been found in near a cornfield outside Des Moines. That was a Monsanto cornfield, and you know, the company protected the corn that was growing there as a trade secret, and so his appearance in that field set off this massive FBI investigation that spanned several years. It involved aerial surveillance, flowing planes overhead, airport busts, an elaborate scheme to smuggle seeds back to China in microwave popcorn bags. And so just this very colorful case, but that also raised the question of why the FBI had devoted such great resources to pursuing it. And that was something that just stuck with me. And then when I moved back to the United States, I decided to go and kind of recreate what had happened in that case.
And were there particular difficulties in dealing with the subject matter in that way and through the vehicle of a single investigation and a single prosecution?
Well, there were a number of other cases that had come out around the same time. I remember talking to you about some of them. You know, this was a period also when Xiaoxing Xi, who was then the interim chair of the physics department at Temple University in Philadelphia, was accused of wire fraud, but of essentially transferring trade secrets back to China. And then charges in his case were very quickly dropped. And so that raised the question of whether there was overreach in some cases. So I decided to use this case of Robert Mo to look at at this broader issue of this trend toward criminalization of trade secrets theft and the devotion of a large number of resources toward fighting IP theft from China. And so I used the kind of very colorful details and scenes in his case, and really retraced all the steps in the case of him, of the investigators, of this American farmer who was kind of caught in the middle as an informant. And it turned out to be quite possible to do that because that case had elicited quite a lot of discovery in court. And so I had I had a kind of step-by-step guide of what had happened in the case.
Well, since your book reads something like a detective novel or a spy thriller, I'm not going to spoil the ending, so to speak, but I would like you to share with our audience today what you think might have been the lessons learned, what came out of your in-depth investigation of this one case and how it was put together in terms of the nature and the size of the threat of industrial espionage from China and the U.S. and the warnings that we've gotten in recent years. In fact, just in the last month, we've had a whole series of major speeches by the Secretary of State, by the Attorney General, by the Director of the FBI, all targeting China and its malign efforts in their view to take intellectual property and other things of the United States for their own uses. Where do you come out on that now?
Well, I do think intellectual property theft is certainly happening to a large degree from China. It has been happening for years. Science and technology collection is a major part of government plans, and for some leaders in China, they see this resource of having access to the United States as a conduit for getting secrets out. That much was there at the time I started reporting that book. There was already quite a lot in the press on the threat of IP theft from China, but I wanted to kind of unpack that and see, what is the best way of addressing it? Is criminal cases that drag on over years, that involve fairly low-level researchers in most cases, is that the best way of dealing with the issue? Partway through my research, I started to look at the issue of corporate power and antitrust issues, because in this case, in the case of the corn seed theft that was at the heart of the book, the victim company was Monsanto, which is one of the major agricultural companies in the world. It's a sector where the largest companies have only gotten larger over the past few years, where there are massive antitrust challenges. And so similar to the way of those of you who watched the big tech hearings yesterday, Mark Zuckerberg has suddenly become a fierce critic of China and of IP theft from China. There is this way that U.S. corporations can deflect from their own antitrust problems and consolidation, which does have a big impact on innovation in America, by focusing on the Chinese threat. And so, I felt that this case could support an entire book because it had all these elements of really colorful scenes, characters or figures who were fairly complex. Robert Moe was in some ways a very sympathetic researcher. He led a suburban existence in Florida with a wife and 2 kids and had lived in the United States for years. And then you also had at the other end a victim company that in many Americans' minds is not very sympathetic.
So the other kind of half of the equation are industrial research labs and academic research centers at our great research universities, like the University of Minnesota, where you live, and the University of Washington, where I live here in Seattle. as part of your overall sort of contextual research and your regular work as a journalist in this field of science and technology, how has this initiative generally been received in higher education, in industrial labs, and among the scientists, particularly the immigrant scientists and engineers who work in these facilities? Do you have some impressions at this point about that?
So one of the things that made this such a compelling topic for the book was that, you know, you have this stated goal of the FBI and now the Justice Department to go after trade secrets theft from China and to really focus on scientific research. And in the past few years, that's meant working with NIH, which administers most grants in the biomedical field in the United States, to root out grant fraud and root out what is said to be IP theft, but I think is often much more complicated. But you have this tension where much of the research force is ethnic Chinese. Often, many researchers are Asian American, or they're working with collaborators from China. They have PhD students from China, and so there has been a lot of pushback among scientists who want more explanation about why the FBI is on campus. You know, in some cases, the FBI has been on campus for, you know, over a year without giving much explanation at all about who is being investigated and why. And you know, if you think of academic institutions historically have a fairly strong resistance to working with the FBI. Under the current administration, that has only heightened because, you know, of all the messaging that's come out from the Trump administration, mixing up things that are legitimate threats from China with just blatant racism and xenophobia. So it's definitely, there's a lot of fear on campus.
And because your book really focuses on a criminal investigation and a criminal prosecution, but you've seen a number of these other cases resolved, you know, through either employee suspensions or terminations or other withdrawal of federal funding and those sorts of things. Do you now have a sense of whether the use of the criminal methodology to treat these problems is a good use of resources or not so good? Where do you come out on that part?
Well, I'm not so prescriptive on what should be done, but it did become clear to me through my reporting that there are immense resources spent on these criminal cases. And that in many cases, they don't produce the targeted results that you might want. And they also run the risk of veering into racial profiling or you know, an appearance of targeting people unfairly, and because they're often focused on individuals. So if you look at the case in my book of Robert Moe, who he's, you know, when the book starts, he's found in this Monsanto cornfield in Iowa. He's clearly up to something as the book goes on, and, you know, becomes clear that he works for this company back in Beijing that has this plan to take hybrid corn seeds from Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer and theoretically reverse engineer them back in China. So they come up with these different ways to send the seed back to China or smuggle it in on the plane and so forth. And, you know, these immense resources devoted to prosecuting Robert, but he was not working alone. There were at some point 5 or 6 other employees of DBN, that company, who were involved in this scheme. The U.S. government was not able to apprehend those people, so they are right now on the FBI's most wanted list. Meanwhile, DBN, the company at the center of this case, suffered very few repercussions. And so, you know, in this whole array of tools that are available to go after IP theft, I would not suggest that closing a consulate is something that should be done, but there are other more targeted tools that involve going, targeting the finances of the company directly, that might be more effective, and would also eliminate this perception of, and in some cases reality of, racial profiling.
So one of the unique features of your book is the intimate portrait that you were able to give us, the sympathetic and rather personal portrait of Dr. Mo. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you came to connect with him and what your interactions were like as he realized you were working on a book about his case?
So yeah, at the time I started the book, there have been a number of longer magazine articles on trade secret theft cases. And, it struck me that in very few of them did the reporters seem to try to reach the defendant or speak with the defendant. That changed a little bit when Xiaoxing Xi's case happened and the charges were dropped, and he and his lawyer went public with the story. And, he has since been very vocal about what happened to him. But at the time, I really wanted to tell the story from all sides. And I also just think for a reader, it's not that interesting to read a kind of black and white, like this is the good guy and this is the bad guy. And it just is uninteresting to me also as a writer to tell a story that way. So I reached out to Robert over the email, at the time, the federal president email system. We corresponded that way for months, and he preferred that to phone calls for various reasons. And he served his sentence now, and he's now in an immigration detention facility. So it's become very very difficult to reach him, and I don't know also the COVID situation in many of those facilities is quite bad. So he's been in a kind of limbo for I think over 6 months.
And so, to your knowledge, he's in an immigration facility because he's in a deportation
Yes.
proceeding at this point.
Right. So he served his sentence, was then put into deportation. But I think that maybe some deportations may be on hold because of the pandemic or various other reasons. China will also have to accept him back, and so that's where it's at now.
Great. So one of the other aspects that is sort of mentioned in your book toward the end, as you describe sort of the larger context of this kind of case. Over the last 20, 25 years, we have had an enormous explosion in the number of international students studying in American institutions of higher education. And those foreign students then remain and join, in many cases, the American workforce, particularly in the STEM fields. And so, at least as of last year's data, probably China provided roughly 1/3 of all the foreign students studying in U.S. institutions of higher education, and produced about 25% of the STEM PhDs coming out of our universities in this country. What do you think is the kind of takeaway lesson from your book about that trend and what the United States has come to sort of rely on both in higher education and in the workforce about these candidates coming out of China?
So I didn't look too extensively at higher education. I did look at what happened at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, because just by coincidence, Robert contracted cancer partway through his prison sentence, or sorry, but he was still at the county jail at that point. And so he sought treatment at MD Anderson. that later became the site of a very extensive FBI investigation into researchers who had ties to China, and that's one of them was quite controversial, with a lot of faculty questioning why the Bureau was poking around on campus for so long. It's come up in the context of the Houston consulate. I do think we're in a very very complicated place as the U.S. and China move toward a more adversarial relationship. To some degree, institutions probably need to be smarter about their ties to China, and about also what they communicate to their researchers in terms of their policies. It became clear at MD Anderson that the institution had encouraged many ethnic Chinese researchers to go back to China and build ties with institutions there. And so then when the FBI came knocking, the individual scientists were kind of thrown under the bus. And I think that's unfortunate.
Well, I think the phenomenon you just described at MD Anderson really was the state of much of higher education, at least in the tier major research universities. I think there was a kind of a golden age of encouraged collaboration and ties. And it's hard to think of a major research university in the country that didn't have its share of both immigrant scientists and engineers and physicians on their faculties, who were then encouraged to open up relationships with colleagues and classmates and former students in China. And deans or development officials at these universities who didn't, go along on trips to China in the hopes of attracting more sponsored research from inside China of one kind or another. So I don't think MD Anderson was particularly unique, and I'm sure while you were working at Science, you saw this phenomenon across the country.
Yeah, and I do think there is a risk in going after addressing this problem of IP theft and grant fraud, that we shoot ourselves in the foot by driving researchers back to China. I mean, this is precisely what the Chinese government has been trying to do for years, is recruit the top researchers from the United States, and they really have had varying degrees of success. Many US-based researchers, have been reluctant to go back to China because there's no tenure, there's a cronyism in the academic system. And after the Wenho Li case in 1999, when this researcher at Los Alamos National Laboratory, it was a very high-profile case where he was accused of espionage, ultimately cleared of 58 of 59 charges. In the aftermath, many researchers from Los Alamos actually left the United States, went back to China, and started a kind of Los Alamos club there. So, that is a loss of the most strategic talent, and exactly what you would want to prevent.
And I think your book mentions the Caltech case from the 1950s as another example of this kind of reverse brain drain, of people coming out of the United States for whatever reason, and then going back to China and making a major contribution to their industrial infrastructure and even to their military programs. Right.
That's another example. The case of Tian Shui-sun in the 50s, who was targeted along with many other scholars at the time for being a suspected communist or member of the Communist Party. And then when he goes back to China, he ends up starting or at least jump-starting the missile program, and setting in motion also some of the surveillance apparatus that's now being expanded today.
And in many ways, I think there's a kind of a historical cycle repeating itself there, because during World War II, he was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, had been sent to Europe to help track down some of Germany's V2 rocket scientists and so forth, and was responsible for helping to bring some of that top talent that ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, as part of Operation Paperclip, that really transferred an enormous amount of technology to the United States and kept it out of the hands of the Soviet Union. And so for him to be pursued so vigorously by the FBI in the 1950s really was a very ironic and counterproductive effort if you look at it through the lens of history.
Yeah, and so I should say that there are really two storylines running through my book. One is the story of Robert Moore, of the FBI agent who pursued him, the American farmer who was caught in the middle. This is the kind of thriller-like drama that's driving the book. But then woven into that, I also wanted to tell the history of the way that Chinese American and ethnic Chinese scientists have been treated in the United States in some of these cases from past decades, because it does seem that they continue to inform the way scientists are treated now. And the FBI has a lot of well-meaning agents and leadership, but at the same time they do have a diversity problem where they have not, predominantly a white bureau, and there have been issues in terms of ethnic bias creeping into investigations.
Well, thank you very much for that kind of overview and introduction to your wonderful book, Mara. Why don't we open it up now to a series of questions from our audience members around the country, and I will let the staff begin feeding those to you. And you don't need me at this point. We'll just have you respond directly to these questions.
We have a question. We have a question, not a question, but a request from Bill Kwong at the 1990 Institute to please speak more about how the case traces back to the Chinese government instead of a Chinese company.
Okay. With all cases of economic espionage, when that's the charge, the U.S. government very much wants to prove a connection to the Chinese government. And it's often hard to prove because, as most of you would know, the Chinese government is sort of everywhere and nowhere all at once. And so in the case of DBN, they were not able to prove that connection, but there were definitely, there are definitely ties. One is that obtaining hybrid corn seed is a major goal, and improving agriculture biotechnology appears in the 5-year plans. It's one of those strategic areas that China is looking to advance in. But in a lot of cases of industrial espionage, it's that there are these stated goals, and not so much that someone is saying, go forth and steal corn, but that companies know that the government's going to look the other way, and that there will be probably few repercussions inside China for stealing a technology. So, at least with these technologies like corn seed, building materials, some of the less not military or dual use technologies, it's often an indirect relationship.
I should add just, I think, one footnote to your comment there, Mara. In fairness to the U.S. government point of view, the warnings coming out of the FBI and the Justice Department and other parts of the U.S. government really speak to the deliberate and intentional use of non-traditional collectors and actors in this drama. And so they are, according to their view of what the problem is, there are business people, there are graduate students, there are undergraduate students, there are trade missions. Almost any kind of non-governmental actor can be used as collectors of this kind of industrial information for use in China. And so that's one of the issues that makes it hard to pin on government, because generally speaking, the people on the ground here may not have any direct government affiliation at all due to this different way of working. Why don't we go to the next question?
We have a question from Tom Grunfeld at SUNY Empire State College. Is Chinese commercial spying different from what other nations have done, such as in the US in the 18th century? And if so, how?
Well, Chinese leaders have argued that it's not. Deng Xiaoping used to argue this, and that no one paid China for gunpowder, for example. But most people say it's happening on a much larger scale. I think it's also to some degree hard to compare because the nature of technology has changed. The value of that technology has changed. We have the internet now. It's a lot easier to spy. And so perhaps if you'd had this rivalry between the United States and the UK at a moment when you had the internet and all of these sophisticated technologies, it would be more comparable. But the case of the US stealing the plans for the power loom from the UK, for example, I think they had to actually go and memorize those plans and then take a ship and then 2 months later arrive in the US and then kind of recreate that machine from memory, which is a very different situation from today when technologies are just much easier to access.
Next question, please.
We have a question from Nick Lardy, who is an NCUSCR director. He is the vice chair, and Peterson Institute. Is it possible to reverse engineer corn seed?
It is. It's apparently there's an easy way that requires a lot of technical knowledge that DBAN did not pursue. So this U.S. farmer I mentioned, who's caught in the middle of all of this, his name is Kevin. He ended up kind of baffled about why they didn't pursue this much easier route. They instead chose a more difficult and complicated path. It involved getting different parents. There's 2 parents of each corn seed, so you need to get both of the parents. They wanted to get hundreds of seed lines, so then they had to get double that for the parents, and you can only get each parent at a certain time of year. So that involved then being in the U.S. on multiple occasions. It was very elaborate, and in the long term, it's probably not the best strategy for becoming the dominant corn seed provider to the world, but in the short term, I think that it could have yielded some gains. And it's unclear how much IP they actually did get in the end. It's likely that they did get some.
Next question, Erica.
Glenn Loveland, he asks, what's going on with these seeds being mailed from China and arriving in the US?
Yeah, I've heard it from every Facebook friend and people who attended talks that I spoke at months ago, and that is a really interesting story. I think that the most plausible scenario is that it's an Amazon review scheme. There was a great Planet Money episode on how this works. It's called review brushing, and a vendor will send many items to addresses in the United States, and they can then write verified reviews about those items. But I do think, if that's true, I find it rather crazy that we are able to buy seeds from overseas on Amazon. That's something I would have wanted to ask Jeff Bezos yesterday. But I talked to my mother, and she's an avid gardener, and she said, "Oh yeah, I've bought lots of seeds from overseas in the past few months during this kind of pandemic gardening surge." So that may be what's going on.
Okay, the next question, please.
We have 2 questions from Daniel Ma at Facebook. The first one is, where will this trend go? It seems that China wants to retaliate on any response from the US government. And the second question, which I'm also curious about, is what is your advice to Chinese Americans who are living and working in the United States?
Well, the first question, I am going to make no predictions about the future right now, given the state of the world and just the kind of volatility, especially of the U.S. China relationship. It is clear, when I started the book, IP was a flashpoint in the relationship between the U.S. and China, and it's only become more so in certainly the past few months. And it's hard to see relations improving before the election. So I think this is very much going to continue to be an issue. Two, what advice to give people? I believe Nelson and others have given seminars for Chinese American scientists with a lot of helpful information on just how to avoid any perception of wrongdoing, because people do make innocent mistakes. And so, you know, it's probably best to go watch one of those if you can find a video of it, or, you know, find slides somewhere, and just make sure that you don't give any appearance of you know, doing anything wrong. And I'm talking about people who are just completely clean and going about their research lives and have no untoward ties. That even then, as the case of Xiaoxing Xi shows, their connections to China can be perceived in this nefarious light. And that unfortunately is the situation that we're in right now.
Since Mara made reference to some of the talks I've given in the past, if I can offer just a couple of tips in answer to the part 2 question. There are many legal obligations of employees, both in private industry and in higher education. And so anybody that's working for a company or for a university needs to understand what their legal duties are to their employer and to the customers of the company or to the sponsors of academic research, whether they're private foundations or federal agencies such as the NIH, the NSF, the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Agriculture, or any other source of federal funding. And there's a vast push on across the U.S. government during this administration, and will probably continue into the next administration, whoever is in the White House, that these federal funding agencies are going to be looking vigorously at ensuring that funded investigators make proper disclosures of their ties to foreign funding sources, to foreign universities, that they disclose when they have a joint appointment, when they have a second job, when they have what government investigators call a shadow laboratory that mirrors the laboratory they may have at a U.S. university. All of those things need to be disclosed forthrightly, both to the host institution and to the U.S. government if you're seeking that kind of federal support. And, you know, just imagine how difficult it will be if it turns out that you fail to make those disclosures in a timely and accurate way, and then somebody knocks on your door and says, we have some agents who want to talk with you today. That's not the scenario you want to set up for yourself. So the first real big tip is understand what your duties are and follow those duties. Erica, next question, please.
We have a question from Sam Borgwart at AMC Entertainment. With continued inflammatory relations between China and the U.S., do you expect any further progress on China-U.S. trade talks on IP theft and enforcement of any agreements?
Again, I don't know. I don't want to make future predictions right now. So I'm sorry. I should add that there has been a fair amount of effort to improve the IP regime within China. And, I know that sounds contradictory with all the news reports that have come out in the past few years. I have heard from IP lawyers who work there that they do have a bit more success of bringing cases in Chinese court. And so, even though this has become a major flashpoint internationally, it is worth it for companies to pursue their cases in China. That may have changed in the past few months. I mean, this is advice from a year or two ago. So
I will only add as a footnote to Mara's comment that the phase 1 trade agreement that was reached between China and the United States in January of this year did contain quite a number of provisions regarding IP improvements in China and backing off of compelled transfers of technology for joint ventures and other business affairs in China, and a host of other technical improvements. I think the business community generally that has been following these issues And I would refer you in particular to the website of the U.S. China Business Council in Washington, D.C., where there's a good deal of information that tracks some of those particular clauses in the Phase 1 agreement and how they have been much welcomed by many of the larger companies who do business from the United States into China. Erica, next question, please.
We received a message without a name. Can you address the relationship between the case which you describe and the changes in policy with respect to genetic modification in agriculture that Xi Jinping has favored?
Right. So at the time that this case started, it was corn, GM corn was not allowed to be commercialized in China, and
GM being genetically modified.
Genetically
right?
modified corn, yeah. But there was this expectation that this would change, and the corn that is at the heart of the case is all genetically modified. And so it's possible, one theory was that DBN was preparing for the eventual change in policy and trying to improve its stock of genetically modified seeds before the policy was changed. But I'm not absolutely certain that was the reason. It's also possible that they sought the seed for other markets elsewhere in the world.
Erica?
We have a question from Kirk Freeman at Georgetown University. Do we need to redefine national security with a stronger emphasis on industrial espionage and financial corruption?
So I would argue that it has already been redefined to include economic security. That's a shift that started in the 1990s when the Economic Espionage Act was passed, but that over the past decade or so, the statements of national security leaders and people in the intelligence community have really shown that there is this broader definition of national security. At the same time, the FBI, after September 11th, transitioned from being strictly a law enforcement agency to being more of a counterintelligence agency. And so that change in definition has also coincided with this change in focus of the FBI to the point where they would really pursue these complicated counterintelligence investigations that are involving foreign countries, extremely complex technologies. And so I would argue that already is the definition, at least as far as US government officials are concerned.
I want to echo what Mara said a moment ago about the change to federal law in the 1990s with the adoption of the Industrial Espionage Statute. In the Title 18 of the United States Code, where these crimes are defined and specified, there are actually two industrial espionage statutes that were put into place at the same time. One is aimed at industrial espionage to benefit private parties, and the other is to benefit a government. And so the notion, even in the 1990s, was that there could be two flavors of industrial espionage, and both of them would be viewed as criminal violations. However, beneath the surface of all these different prosecutions that we read about in the Wall Street Journal and these other newspapers around the country, there really is a vast array of different criminal statutes that the FBI and the Justice Department can enforce from time to time. And so you heard, for instance, Mara describe Dr. Xi's case in Philadelphia as involving fraud. There's a wire fraud statute, a mail fraud statute, government fraud statute. And so there are many different tools, the conspiracy statute, false statement statute, which is kind of the Swiss Army knife of federal laws, Title 18, Section 1001. Anytime you make a false statement to a federal official or an agent, that's a separate crime. So sometimes they don't have anything else to prosecute someone on. You can always reach for Section 1001 if they have told a falsehood to an agent in the course of an interview while conducting one of these investigations. So it's important to realize that we're not overly focused just on the industrial espionage statutes, but there is really quite a toolbox available to federal agents and federal investigators. And more we're seeing some of these bleed over into even things like visa fraud. And for instance, the last few cases in the past month where these different PLA officers are accused of having simply lied on their visa application and said that they were not active duty PLA officers when the US government has evidence to the contrary. That's a crime. And so, but it's subsumed under the category of industrial espionage because it's alleged that they went to work for this or that university or this or that company without disclosing really the nature of their day job, so to speak, in the Chinese military. Erica, next question, please.
We have a question from Robert Kapp at Robert A. Kapp and Associates. Can you comment on U.S. efforts to secure Chinese-controlled technologies? He also has a PS, proud to see a Swarthmorian doing distinguished work.
So U.S. efforts to
secure Chinese-controlled technologies.
Yeah, the flip side case.
Oh, meaning to spy on Chinese companies. That's an interesting question. I did not come across any examples of cases like that in my research. So I should say that there is a case of a geologist Shui Feng, who is a U.S. citizen working for a Texas company who was imprisoned in China for years for I think they hit him with state secrets, but you know you could look at that as sort of the flip side of China going, oh look, we found this U.S. researcher who's here poking around and looking for our technology. This concerned oil databases in the Northwest. So there have been cases like that that people close to Shui Feng feel like those were spurious charges.
Erica, next question, please.
We have a question from our Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, Jan Barris. Getting away from your book for a moment, you recently wrote an excellent op-ed on the closing of the Houston consulate. Can you talk about that briefly, focusing on the U.S. government's explanation that espionage was the reason for the closure? It's my understanding that part of the work of diplomatic missions around the world, including U.S. embassies and consulates, is to engage in quote-unquote information gathering about their host countries.
Right. So the U.S. government has always distinguished, and I shouldn't say always, but since the 1990s has distinguished between spying for political purposes and industrial espionage. And the claim with the Houston consulate was that this consulate was particularly active in economic espionage and S&T collection. Since I wrote that, I've heard that there are some cases that haven't been made public, but it came out in the Houston Chronicle yesterday that there is concern about China targeting vaccine research in the University of Texas system. So that is entirely possible, but I do think that more explanation is required. And there is also the question of, if this consulate really was a hotbed of economic espionage, was closing it the best tool, or are there other tools that could have been available to us in that situation? And that is also a topic on which there's a lot of debate.
I think one of the tools that Mara is referring to is the traditional remedy of declaring individual diplomats who are detected in doing things inconsistent with their diplomatic function, declaring them persona non grata and giving them 72 or 96 hours to get out of the country. And that is used all the time against diplomats of countries that with embassies and consulates in the United States, and every so often it happens to our own diplomats in other countries as well. And that would have been a less intrusive, less disruptive response, because it's unlikely that every single employee in that consulate was engaged in this kind of conduct.
I think
Next.
also
Yeah.
oh yeah, sure. I
Go
think
ahead.
the skepticism also comes because it's, it's the week of Mike Pompeo's speech about this shift in China strategy, comes on the heels of floating the idea of declaring all party members, you're barring all party members and their relatives from the United States. So just, the series of events leading up to it are maybe partly what contributed to skepticism.
I would love this conversation to continue going, but I think we probably have one more minute of time. Erica, do you want to give us the last question, and then we'll wrap it up with Margot's comments?
First, we have a question from Yu Zhou, a professor at Vassar. Chinese American scientists have made a lot of contributions to the advancement of science in the US. I am troubled by the complete lack of acknowledgement of that in the media. I am wondering whether focusing on a few criminal cases would set the science back in the United States. Since you have covered the collaboration, do you have any suggestions to highlight Chinese American scientists and their contributions to the science in the US?
Well, that's a good question. I think, especially in the context of all of the hate crimes that have flared up in the past few months, with the president using terms like Chinese virus and Wuhan flu and so forth. And I do think there is a problem with media coverage of some of these cases, but also with some of the language that prosecutors use in some cases. I think there's some media coverage that's very measured. There's other coverage that uses these, in which scientists are compared to animals or locusts or in a swarm. I mean, these are some of the passages I talked about in the book. And I find that very problematic. It's very otherizing. This is not an issue that's unique to coverage of these trade secrets thefts, but the media does have this tendency to convict somebody publicly before they have had their time in court. And I think that certainly happens with these cases where some of the standards that we would normally apply of not naming someone until they're charged are sometimes thrown out the window. And so I would hope that we get we have a discussion about that kind of coverage going forward.
Maura, I got a note by chat from Margot that we can go a little bit longer if you have the time to stay. I'm perfectly happy to continue this dialogue a little bit longer. All right?
I have 10 minutes or so.
All right, then let's go a little bit further. Erica, why don't you tee up the next one then, and we'll just keep going as long as we can.
Sounds good. We have a question from Yue. She recently graduated from SUNY Buffalo, and her question is, do you think there will be a decrease in numbers of Chinese international students pursuing in higher education in the US, in parentheses, engineering or technology fields, after several reveals of similar espionage cases? If so, what would be the influence of this? Just curious, have you come across other industrial espionage related to other ethnical background researchers?
So certainly industrial espionage is not limited to China. The bulk of cases that we see come to light do involve China, but when the Economic Espionage Act was passed in the 1990s, the concern at the time was really France and Israel. And Israel has a very sophisticated intelligence apparatus, and I would think is still pretty active in economic espionage as well. But in terms of whether we would see a decline in students coming to the United States, I have heard, even before, say, the past 6 months, I'd heard from principal investigators that their potential PhD students are worried about the climate in the United States. I think now there is so much happening with the requirement that foreign students be on campus, the potential CCP member ban, all of these things I'm sure contribute, but it's really at this point it must be a snowball effect, and I think it would be hard to separate out exactly why people are making the decisions that they are. But it's certainly an interesting question going forward, because historically we do have fewer American-born kids going into STEM fields, and so that's one of the reasons we become this center for talented researchers from around the world.
All right, I'm a little reluctant to close the program because I think it has been so incredibly fascinating, and our audience thinks so too. They've stayed with us. So thank you so much to Nelson and Mara for spending time with us this afternoon and illuminating such interesting, important topics. And before we go, I would like to call our audience's attention to a program that the National Committee is doing on August 6th on science and education in the crossfire. It should be really fascinating, and if I can get to it fast enough, I'll send the link to the chat so everybody can sign up for it. So again, thank you very much to our speaker and our moderator, and another plug for the book. It's really terrific.
It's a great book.
You.
Take care. Thank you,
all.
Mara. Thank you, Margot.